Hey there everyone, AJ back again for the Mighty Glue Stick channel. So I am asked on occasion if I make custom monsters for my games, and yes, I do quite a lot. I also include anything I find on the internet that suits what I want in the game. I also run encounters that are grossly unfair both to players and also a lot of the feeble monsters who end up getting slaughtered just because they were in the wrong place at the wrong time and made a bad call on attacking grossly superior foes. Monsters are often stupid and that sort of thing does happen, and albeit doesn't know the difference between a level 1 wizard and a level 10 wizard, they both look delicious. On that note, there should be, and in any fantasy gaming world, just plain unusual, but when you think about it, kind of logical pest critters that are really not important, unless all of a sudden they become critically important. Here is an example in our real world, and I have to add, this is a creature that most often simply stuns me with how amazing they are at what they do. And I was inspired to make this video simply because I'm sitting here watching a video on YouTube and eating these confections called fruit bursts. They're kind of like a very sweet, overly flavoured taffy. For some reason we have confections that are just loaded with fruit esters and highly processed sugar in New Zealand, noticeably more than America, believe it or not. I don't know why. Anyway, I'm eating these things and my room has only one window open, just a crack, because it's the middle of winter here. It's about 4 PM in the afternoon, the sun is setting in just a couple of hours, and I have this little insect fly towards my face. So I shoo it away with my hand and I notice it's a fruit fly. Then I think, wow, the middle of winter, this thing has detected the few molecules of fruit acid vapor that have escaped from my window, followed that trail with pinpoint accuracy right to its source, and I've only been chewing on these things and breathing out the fumes for about 15 minutes. That is mind-boggling. Consider this, the season, the middle of winter, and this little girl is out looking for fruit. And it's not a very windy day. She picks up the scent of ripe fruit, makes a trek of possibly hundreds of meters, and ends up the only insect inside my entire room, aside from those long-legged squatters, the spiders in the corner who seem to just sit there until they starve to death. Honestly, most of them just leave after a few weeks for better hunting grounds. This fruit fly is not an agile beast. I actually swat it out of the air, and she spirals over to a nearby wall and reconsiders her options. Now she's probably going to fly directly into my coffee cup, since that's what happens more often than is statistically likely. Okay, so in the world of Dungeons & Dragons, there should be, I think, relatively harmless and very common creatures that are attracted to magic auras and energies. Some equivalent of a fey fruit fly, or perhaps is some shadowfowl scarab that's attracted to necrotic energy, much like rats congregate around sources of garbage and flies swarm around dead meat. I can just picture the local city wizard academy with some sort of trap or sticky flypaper that accumulates piles of these little fey sprites. Perhaps they look really weird, like a gnat-sized eyeball with itty-bitty tentacles and wings, or they look like a snowflake or dust mote, but it's actually a fairy. They may have a tiny humming trill, not like the wings are buzzing, but their tiny little mouth is singing. The necrotic scarabs would be a sure sign that undead are around here somewhere, and perhaps in places where undead are more common, such as Thay, they're actually quite a nuisance, lurking in cracks and shadows like cockroaches, causing fruit and bread to spoil if they crawl over it and absorb the feeble necrotic energy of the rot and decay. I can imagine a lich flicking them off their desk, crammed with tomes and dusty scrolls, brushing them out of its old robes, casting spells and waving the little eyeballs out of its face, and the arcane candle or glowing crystal being orbited by these haphazard flights of the gossamer sprites. What if the fighters and clerics, who wear a lot of metal armor and weaponry, had to deal with rust not just as a chemical process, but if there were tiny insect-sized rust monster relatives that they had to remove that accumulate on metal like dust mites infest piles of old books? What if rust in the Dungeons & Dragons universe is much slower than it is here, and most of the decay of the things there was instead more of a process of living organisms? When you look at the massive biodiversity of life forms in the D&D world, this really does make a lot of sense from a biological point of view, because where does all this basic biomass come from to support the gargantuan biosphere? How can there possibly be any hope for more mundane creatures to exist if there are all these fantastic beasts wandering around eating everything? I get this question quite a lot. Well, I suggest that there are far more little exotic quirks to these fantasy planets than we really encapsulate and convey in the source books. Much like we would not think of mentioning something like a fruit fly or a grasshopper to a visitor from another world who has never seen those things before. It just wouldn't be on the front of our mind to say, hey, have you look at these grasshoppers? So it might be that a fun exercise for you and me with a simple enough concept. There are tiny, flat Dull orange segmented creatures, mostly like insects but not exactly the same, that probably evolved in volcanic vents under the sea or some other plane of existence, that feed on metal with the exact same effect as rust. They're not fond of oil, but can survive in airless environments but not digest metal at the same time, and they propagate by releasing airborne spores like a fungus, but they're tiny eggs. The eggs are consumed by a wide array of filter feeders that look like moss, fungus, other insects. This perhaps is where shriekers came from, absorbing air from the environment and taking in biomass that way. They may have almost an entire other food web with specialist digestive traits and specializations, niches that they and different types of creatures particularly fill. Where somewhere near the apex you could find the rust monster. Perhaps the entire ecology of the plane of Archeron is like that. Those tremendous geometric metal solids all drifting around in a collective airspace stands to reason that metals would form the base of their source of all their entire biosphere. I like to make little side comments about things like this in my games, that the dead dragon has become infested with Draco mites, which are eating its elementally infused body tissues. If there's a dragonborn in the party, perhaps they're loath to go anywhere near the things, which are harmless to other humanoids, but the equivalent of Lyme disease carrying ticks to draconic beings. Maybe goblinoids have diseases that dwarves are actually more prone to catching than half-orcs and dragonborn are totally immune. What happens when a human catches the halfling cold? Imagine if a celestial gives a mortal a simple drink of water from a flask filled on the slopes of Mount Celestia from a rainbow-illuminated waterfall, and the water has microbes in it that cause the natural healing rate of the mortal to double for 48 hours or more. So, let's see, they'd basically have twice as many hit dice to spend in 5th edition. In 3.5 edition, they'd have their level times 4. In 3rd edition, it would be the level times 3. In 2nd edition, it would be 6 hit points. In D&D Basic, it would be 2 to 6 hit points, and in 1st edition, it would be 2 hit points. Oh, and the original boxed D&D White set, it would be 1 hit point. Wow, healing's really changed a lot over the various editions of D&D. I should point out, once again, that my view on hit points and what they represent is the same as Gary Gygax, and I have a direct quote from him that sums up this nicely. It is quite unreasonable to assume that, this is Gary speaking, it's quite unreasonable to assume that a character gains levels of ability in his or her class that a corresponding gain in actual ability to sustain physical damage takes place. It is preposterous to state such an assumption, for if we were to assume that a man is killed by a sword thrust which does 4 points of damage, we must similarly assume that a hero could, on the average, withstand 5 such thrusts before being slain. Why then the increase in hit points? Because these reflect both the actual physical ability of the character to withstand damage, as indicated by Constitution bonus, and a commensurate increases in such skills as in combat and similar life or death situations. The sixth sense, which warns the individual of some otherwise unforeseen events, sheer luck, and the fantastic provisions of magical protections and or divine protection. Therefore, Constitution affects both actual ability to withstand physical punishment, hit points, physique, and the immeasurable areas which involve the sixth sense and luck and fitness. End quote. So your character does become fitter, stronger, more able to take a beating, but the majority of their increase in hit points is about damage avoidance and their cardio capacity, rather than being any ability to take getting stabbed by a sword, tooth or claw. Nobody gets better at being mauled by a tiger. You can just learn to avoid getting mauled by tigers. I think one of the downsides to playing Dungeons & Dragons, one of the few downsides, as opposed to some other rule systems, is that hit points are so all-inclusive. For example, how much damage can your suit of scale mail take before it's rendered useless or destroyed? Exactly how much damage can it soak up from an incoming fireball? Why would a metal breastplate give more protection from Mal's acid arrow than a full suit of leather armor? There have been some steps towards, forwards and backwards on this issue with the game system over the years, but really it would take a complete overhaul of the basic combat system to correct this lack of detail and realism. Not so with weird, exotic and unusual insects, plants, pests and ecosystems. We can load these into our narrative of the game environment and make them part of your own world of Toril, my world, your world, all the different worlds of Toril, or Athos, Kryn, Galarian, or your own homebrew world that may be connected to these other worlds. There's no limit to your imagination, and you should, I advise you, expect your players to find ways you never expected to make these passing narrative footnotes critically important to your story. far more than is entirely reasonable. For example, let's say there's these little glow gossamer fairies that emit light as they waft around magic auras. Your player says, how much light would it shed, bright light in a 5-foot radius? And you check your source books and reply, no, it's not as bright as a candle. After some discussion, you say it sheds bright light within a half a foot of the swarm of them that's consisting of no less than 30 individuals. This is the sort of specific conversation that you have at gaming tables. And dim light to a maximum of 5 feet. The player promptly drops a magic ring with a string tied to it into a jar, waits for it to fill with these little fey critters, pokes a hole in the jar lid and puts the string through, and drops the jar down into a dark pit, where it hits the bottom, which they now know is 30 feet down. The glass smashes, the critters fly around the ring, and the characters can see the bottom of the pit is full of long metal spikes covered in rust mites, which she is allergic to because she's a halfling, or maybe a gnome. I don't know, it's your game. But also, there is a skeleton down there with a backpack which looks like a nice shield attached to it, and there's a short sword. The player then pulls the ring back up on the string, and the DM gives them inspiration for such a clever idea. So, have big and exciting, fantastic and monstrous ideas, yes, but also lots of little quirky and strangely detailed ideas. Take notes, lots of notes. Encourage players to make use of the exotic environment and the magical oddball creatures that live on these alien worlds. They will stop asking questions like, how can anyone farm sheep when there are griffins? Or how can there be a city that like that with no surrounding farmlands? What do these people eat? Because they know this is not medieval Europe. It only superficially resembles it in certain ways. Great. Now I've lost track of the fruit fly, and my habit of drinking black coffee from a large black mug is giving me disadvantage on my perception check to see if this is in fact taken a dive into my beverage. Probably time to make a fresh cup. Just a reminder, if you've not subscribed already, feel free to do so. Be sure to hit the like button and the notification bell as I upload from the other side of the world sometime in your future. For access to all of the scripts and 1 week advance access to these videos, consider becoming a patron on the channel on Patreon for a minimum of just $1 per month. Join the community on our Discord server, come say hi. Also, if you want to pick up a video game at a significant daily discount and help me out in the process, check out the daily deal on Chrono. There's a different game every single day. Link down below in the video description text. Remember, those discounts only last for 1 day, so check back on them frequently. As always, thanks for listening. I'll be back with more for you very soon.